Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for taking time from your schedule and joining us today for this discussion with regards to the economics of biodiversity and what frameworks, recommendations exist today that can be used by industry but also by governments, along with having a look at some of the case studies. So, firstly, uh, depending on where you are, ni hao, konnichiwa, xin chao, namaste, salam, bonjour, guten morgen. Thanks a lot for taking time from wherever you are and for joining us today. And thank you also for sharing the kind of work that your company and you are doing. It gives us an idea on what you might be hoping and expecting from today's discussion. So what we see is we have stakeholders from brands, retailers, but also from state governments. There are investors in there. There are industry associations, standard developers, and also intergovernmental organizations. Also interesting to see is the breadth and depth of the industry sector which is represented. So we have textiles, of course, we have companies involved in delivering services. These are investors in some cases, or consultants, let's say, but also food industry representatives, electronics, textiles, and so on. Now, as we start off, perhaps we should start looking at why are we talking about this? Many of us have firmly etched in our minds, in our verbiage, this new vocabulary with regards to biodiversity, whether it be no net loss, whether it be conservation, protection, and so on. So we'll start looking at what's happening overall in our world in terms of biodiversity, protection, conservation, the opportunities and risks that it presents. But then we also start looking at why is it important? Why is it important for our financial sector overall? This will be shared by Mr. Peter Elwin, who's at Planet Tracker. After which, we'll see how governments establish plans, guidelines, framework to address the topic of biodiversity and how they involve the private sector into this. Following which, we will look at some examples and some case studies about this particular framework, the STAR metric or framework, where the biodiversity consultancy will share with us what can be used today by industry. And listening at the risks, what governments can do, what companies can do, it's only relevant that we also start looking at what is happening, what are companies and industries doing. So we'll have a few case studies from Tata Steel, but also from this initiative in India about biodiversity business initiatives. So to start off, what we are talking about is related to nature. And as all of us know and experience and see every day, everything around us is coming from nature. We, our lives, our economies are part of nature, of this ecosystem. So it only makes sense to focus on it. One of the big announcements from this year was with regards to this final report on the economics of biodiversity based on the Dasgupta review, where we see not just the opportunities and risks, but also some directions and guidelines on how to move forward, whether it be with regards to transforming our institutions or to change the measures that we are using today about economic success of countries, of economies, but also to balance this impact of equation between businesses and nature with regards to what nature supplies to us and how we responsibly use it. So while we hear about those opportunities and risk eloquently described in the report, we also see that ratings agencies, independent organizations also start looking at what are the risks posed to countries due to, let's say, biodiversity loss. This went a little further, and considering a lot of our audience from Asia, it has also been quantified, where we see that Asia Pacific also has this significant set of risks because of biodiversity loss. But like we know and like we hear and like we have experience, with risks also come opportunities. So there's this interesting report that was published by Temasek from Singapore, which identifies the overall opportunities, both in terms of economic contribution, but also in terms of jobs, when biodiversity is handled in the right way. This report also drills further into which are the industry sectors which can contribute to these opportunities and tries to quantify these risks and opportunities. We also see that one of the experts in the field of circular economy has identified and shared a pathway on how circular economy can play a role in conserving, safeguarding biodiversity and working within the laws of nature. And importantly, on World Biodiversity Day today, we saw that the one positive thing that is happening is with regards to the population of whales. And like we know that whales have this amazing contribution to our ecosystem, whether it be in terms of, let's say, carbon sequestration, or just making sure about the quality of water and water-related resources is working in a way that is positively contributing to our lives and to our industries. But like with every new initiative, every new area where there's risk and opportunities, there were a set of eager and curious and motivated stakeholders who got together. And we see several initiatives and these acronyms bringing together experts, interests, whether it be a particular industry sector or on regional level, which address both investors in some cases, but also the corporates who are involved. And these range from disclosure topics, target setting, boundaries to be considered, or impact measurement. Today, during our talk, we will hear a little bit more about TNFD, SBTN, but also biofin. And we'll also look at some examples of target setting. Yeah. What we heard recently, the big news was about the COP, the climate COP, which was also the first climate COP, which spoke and which mentioned and which documented this interlinkage and nexus with water, with nature, and so on. At the same time, there's a COP for nature going on, the biodiversity related COP. So while we have the overall COP meeting where the negotiations take place with the governments, there's also a lot of other activity happening on city level, together with the youth, together with business and biodiversity forums in Europe, in India, in China, in Japan, and in many other countries. What happens next is after phase 1 of the next COP for biodiversity, discussions will start off again early next year, and they will finally culminate in China in April, May. Now, as we start looking at the possibilities and the reasons why investors should be looking at it, it's interesting briefly to see what you provided as feedback when we asked what are environmental or climate related initiatives that your organizations are already working on. So a lot of you mentioned about resource efficiency. So the better resources being managed, it's better for cost, of course, it's better for energy. But in a way, when resources are coming from renewable sources, it of course can also support overall ecosystem. We also see a lot of you are investing into renewable energy, both from the perspective of GHG emission reduction, and as we know that this also has a positive contribution to impact on nature. And we see your focus on air and water pollution, addressing that, addressing habitat loss and degradation, soil and water contamination. These are some of the points that we will dwell further into via our experts. Now, the interesting part, we asked you, what do you see as roadblocks and barriers for mainstreaming biodiversity considerations within your plans? And we see that almost a quarter of you mentioned, a little over a quarter, that it becomes difficult for a company to bring together its neighbors. Sometimes these are competing organizations, sometimes these are farms, sometimes these are societies where people are living, bringing them together and making everybody cooperate for safeguarding these common resources, water, species, soil in the vicinity. We also see that over a quarter of you mentioned that there's insufficient information out there about the impact to your businesses due to, let's say, biodiversity loss. Then we see you mentioned that there's a lack of clear business case to safeguard biodiversity. So we'll see some examples of that today. And a lack of local laws or regulations, such that let's say the playing field is not level, so you're hoping that there are greater laws which are enforced. So to start looking at it, I think it's worthwhile that we start talking from the economic perspective. For that, we have Mr. Peter Elvin. He heads the fixed income team and also the food and land use along textile programs at Planet Tracker. Together with his team, they provide these very useful, informative reports which go into a Bloomberg Refinitiv, which are used by the trading community. An interesting part from about Peter, while he was elaborating with regards to the rainforests and the impact from Brazil and how it could potentially positively support not just the industry there, but our overall ecosystem, he was interrupted by ducks. So he very well knows the power of nature. Peter, if you could take the decades of experience that you have and the amazing work that your team has been doing and try and compress in about 12 to 15 minutes and take us through this journey about what Planet Tracker is doing and what is your observation in terms of why biodiversity considerations are relevant for the finance sector.
Thank you, Rakesh. And yes, I've safely got the ducks penned up. Unfortunately, as well as COVID, we're suffering bird flu in the UK. So all our avian friends have to be penned up in lockdown as well. So I won't be interrupted. But thank you for your kind introduction. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see those slides. So the question that was posed to me, the topic I was asked to address at the start of this seminar, and it's a real privilege to be with such experts. So I feel rather humbled to be presenting on biodiversity in the face of so many other people who know so much more about it. But I was asked to talk about why financial markets should care about biodiversity. Now, I guess perhaps the underlying question might well be, do financial markets care about biodiversity? And I think, unfortunately, at the moment, the answer to that might be, in many cases, not much. In some cases, not at all. And in a few cases, yes, they do care quite a lot. But at the moment, I think it's fair to say that biodiversity and what you might call nature more broadly is further sort of down the list of priorities and the list of considerations in the financial markets than, for example, the climate crisis, which is now very much front and center. But having said that, my view, and I think it's a view shared by quite a lot of people, and it was implied by Rakesh's introduction, my view is that biodiversity and the focus on nature more broadly than just climate will rapidly catch up with the climate debate, and the two will begin to run in parallel relatively quickly. And by that, I mean over the next probably 2 or 3 years in practice. And as we'll see as we go through the course of this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, we'll see that those two things, nature and climate, are inextricably linked and actually really cannot be considered separately. So a focus on biodiversity is absolutely necessary. Just a brief bit about Planet Tracker. Rakesh gave you a little overview. So we are a non-profit financial think tank focused on aligning capital markets with planetary boundaries. So our sort of duty or objective is to persuade the investment community to embed natural capital, nature, biodiversity, and climate into their investment processes and their investment thinking, so that ultimately they are directing the capital they manage in support of a sustainable future and taking it away from activities that actually are harming the planet and putting humanity's future at risk. Now, it's a truism to say that we depend upon nature, and I think the Dasgupta review, which I'm sure we've all read, at least all of us on this panel have read to some extent, makes the case very, very clearly that the whole of our economy, our very existence, of course, is ultimately dependent upon nature. We need clean air, we need clean water, we need all the services that the natural environment provides to us as human beings and to our businesses. And some sort of quick takeaways: the Dasgupta review estimated that capital per person doubled between 92 and 2014. Human capital per person increased by about 13%, but natural capital per person declined by nearly 40%. Now, if you put that into a financial context, the sort of thing that I do every day, if we were looking at a business where they have that sort of deterioration in the underlying support base for the business, we would regard that business as probably in crisis, and certainly would be in crisis if the financial markets came to really start pricing that in. We cannot survive with that rate of depletion continuing into the future. Now, part of the problem, of course, is that our current economies and the way that our tax and subsidy systems are structured, governments and other authorities are effectively incentivizing people to damage nature. A lot of our farming subsidies, a lot of the other subsidies associated with our food systems, our energy systems, our transport systems actually have a harmful impact on nature. And again, in the Dasgupta review, they estimate that the actual value of that is about $4 to $6 trillion per annum, which is an extraordinary amount of money, and far outweighs the amount of money that's actually being invested in support of nature. So at the moment, the financial balance is completely wrong. Now, there have been a whole range of studies looking at how biodiversity does actually impact companies and therefore should be of direct relevance to the financial markets. You can see a sort of an outline sketch here of some of the areas where biodiversity risk is particularly significant. Very obviously, agriculture and fishing. So anything relying sort of directly on nature for a sort of economic reward, they will be very, very much at threat. But there are other sectors. The insurance sector would be an obvious one because of the risks they're insuring. Take a very simple example. If you're insuring against flood risk and a biodiversity is being reduced in a particular area, that will often be associated with a reduction in the sort of the nature-based solutions that will prevent flooding, trees, bushes, the soil absorption, and all the characteristics of the local environment. And that will increase flooding risk, that will increase the losses to the insurance company, and they will obviously then have to raise premiums. So insurance companies also very much at the fore of this. Mining companies would be another area that are very, very exposed, and obviously shipping. But part of the challenge, and you can see again from that table, that if you're looking at this from a sort of purely financial perspective, you might say real estate. Well, no, actually, the risk that it faces from biodiversity loss is not really on the horizon. The financial sector, an area that I spend a lot of time looking at, again, you could say, well, perhaps it's not really very threatened by biodiversity loss. Now, our thesis in Planet Tracker is that is missing the point. That if you analyze things purely on a traditional sort of credit basis or a traditional equity analysis sort of process, you are ignoring so many of these externalities, both the risks and, as Rakesh was highlighting in his introduction, also potentially the rewards. So we need the financial markets to look further. Now, I just wanted to leave you with a couple of sort of key reasons why the financial markets really should focus on biodiversity, and to put that in a financial markets context, which again is a lot of what we spend most of our time doing at Planet Tracker. We try and take the underlying academic research and the sort of the raw data that's been gathered by experts in the field, which is often quite hard for the financial markets to really price in, and we synthesize and sort of convert that information into language and techniques that are acceptable and accessible to the financial markets. The financial markets are very, very aware of the concept of diversification. If any of you have got some sort of pension plan or some other long-term savings plan invested with a fund manager, no doubt they will have asked you about your risk appetite and your desire for diversification. And don't put all your eggs in one basket. And we do that with our stocks and shares. We do that with our investments just sort of as a routine thing. And you can see from the chart on the left, the more stocks you have up to a limit, the less sort of risk that you're getting from your risk exposure you're getting from any particular stock in that portfolio. Nature is the same. The more diversity we have across our nature base, then the more resilience we have in the system. A very simple example would be if you think of something like a crop of wheat or crop of rice. If we have multiple species of wheat that we can use to grow and feed ourselves, or rice, then we are not exposed or not nearly so exposed to the risk of disease or indeed climate change impacting any one particular crop, because we will always have another type of wheat or another type of rice which we can grow in the new circumstances and use to feed the world. If we've narrowed the range of biodiversity, then we're much, much more at risk of that sort of key species being taken out. And part of the problem we have as a sort of a species, as humanity, and the problem the financial markets face is that we don't know which species is ultimately going to turn out to be crucial because of the really complicated web of life on which we rely. So ultimately, having broad diversity in our natural capital base is absolutely essential as a support for resilience for our economy. Our economy relies on this solid, diverse base. Now, on the other side, you can also introduce another financial markets concept, the concept of option value, the value of having choices. Again, the financial markets are very used to the idea that the more choices you have, then potentially the more value there is to be exploited in the future, and that has a value in today's terms. Now, clearly, biodiversity provides humanity with, as a paper in 1976 said, a range of options to utilize species in ways yet undetermined. And we can see that going on all around us, particularly in terms of the pharmaceutical industry and the development of new sort of biotechnologies, very often derived from a natural base, a particular species that has only recently been discovered to provide extraordinary benefits. Now, it's worth just noting that paper was written in 1976, which is probably before many of the people on this webinar were born. And certainly a very, very long time ago compared to the sort of debate about biodiversity now. So I think the challenge for all of us is that this issue has been thought about for a long time. It is only now coming to the fore. And the question, why should the financial markets care about it? I hope I've addressed that at least in part. Do they care about it? Perhaps not as much as they should. And that's really the mission for the next few years. Thank you, Rakesh.
All right. Thanks a lot, Peter. Before we move on, what has been your observation based on your initial overview of upcoming policies, regulation, initiatives, when you have been engaging with your clients who have been, let's say, investors? Are they looking at it and saying, oh, too complicated, let's park it for later now? Or are they saying, oh, well, I think, Peter, we need a 2-day deep dive workshop?
Yes, it's probably somewhere in between. I think in general, the financial markets are confused and struggle with the complexity. They don't feel they have great data coming from the companies they invest in or the governments whose bonds they invest in. So complexity and a lack of data is a problem. And as I said at the beginning, I think the vast majority of them are sort of thinking a little bit, well, let's try and handle climate first and we'll come on to biodiversity. There are a few who are more at cutting edge, but it's very early days. So I don't think anybody's demanding a 2-day in-depth seminar yet, but that's what we're hoping for over the next 2 years, I think.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Peter. Now, having looked at why it's relevant for financial markets, the next part comes, well, we're talking about resources which do not belong to one particular company per se, but let's say these are the common resources. And how to articulate the value of these resources, how to make sure that all stakeholders in that vicinity are doing the right thing on a state level, on a country level, and how to interlink this with the financial market so as to involve private investors. For this, we have Mr. Hervé Barois. He's with Biofin. He has over 20 years of experience working on the area of environmental finance. He also has deep experience in identifying projects for GEF, for the Global Environment Facility, for the European Union, and so on. And what he will share with us is some of the work that UNDP Biofin is doing in supporting governments, whether it be from the aspect of sustainable resource management and what kind of framework there should be, or biodiversity conservation, and then how to involve private sector within this. So again, if Hervé, if you can take maybe 10, 12, 15 minutes and share with us UNDP Biofin, but also some interesting stories based on your recent engagement with governments, state level or country level.
Thank you very much, Rakesh, for the kind introduction, and thanks a lot, Peter, for setting up very well the stage and the context at the global level. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
If you could set it to presentation mode. Yeah.
It is on presentation mode now.
Okay, let's go through it then.
Let's go through it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I will just. Peter already described the context and Rakesh as well. So will go too much in detail in that. Just a reminder that 50% of the global GDP is moderately or highly dependent from nature. And the World Economic Forum as well has listed environmental biodiversity loss as the top 5 risks around the world. So that's a prime importance for the private sector to take this into consideration, because if a risk unfold in the coming 10 years, economic development could stop or even could decrease. As well, you see in the global discussion, climate change, it's been the highlight recently. And for climate mitigation and climate adaptation, it's clear now that nature-based solution is the way forward, and it should be implemented by government and private sector. So this is just to set the stage. And BioFin, it's UNDP, so from a United Nations Development Program. It's funded by Germany, Norway, the Swiss, and the Flemish governments. And it started in 2012. And the overall aim is to create a global collaborative partnership to develop and implement evidence-based methodology that improve biodiversity outcome using finance and economics. So basically, is to put together all stakeholders, government, private sector, and civil society together to try to address biodiversity loss to ensure long-term sustainable development by addressing and putting in place the right financial framework at national level. So we started in 2012. We had a phase 1, 2012-2018, where we developed a global methodology, which has been implemented around 40 countries around the world. And you can see the map here. There's few change now because new countries have joined. And from 2018 up to 2025, we enter the phase in most of these countries to implement finance solution identified at national level. So in a nutshell, the methodology that we developed, which has been used and tested in more than 40 countries around the world, it helps us to identify the right set and mix of finance solutions to address biodiversity loss at national level, and which integrate private sector, government, and civil society. There is 5 steps to do that. The first step is to look at the policy and institutional review.
Hervé,
yes.
We are still seeing the first slide, yeah? So maybe you might want to click on the particular slide instead.
I'm already on my screen on another slide.
Yes. So we are still seeing the first slide. Maybe you can click on the particular slide number so it goes through step by step. Yeah. Okay, we still see the first slide.
Okay. So I'll go.
Now. Yeah. Now we see. Now we see slide 2. Yeah.
Slide 2. Slide 3.
Yeah. Now we see.
Slide 4.
Yes. Now we can see.
Okay. That's the map around the world.
Now we see the map. Yeah.
Okay, and now it's a methodology where I am now, right?
Okay.
So it's a 5-step methodology, all right? The first step is to look at the policy and institutional framework for biodiversity finance. So that means we look at the biodiversity aspect, try to identify at national level what are the biodiversity loss driver, what are the policy related to biodiversity, but at the same time, we try to link it up to the financial framework and look at the financial policy and driver within the country, and we create this linkage together, and as well with the legal framework related to financial instruments and biodiversity instruments. The second step is to try to identify and quantify the biodiversity expenditure at national level. We try to quantify how much government spend on biodiversity at national level, how much private sector spend at national level, and how much the civil society spend at national level, and for which purpose, for what. And we try to carry out these studies over a time frame of 5 to 15 years to see the trend, to see if it increased, if it decreased, and what are the issues, and how expenditure are targeted. The third step, we take as a reference, usually in most countries around the world, you got a strategy, the NBSAP, National Strategy for Biodiversity Conservation, and try to quantify how much the financial need to implement this national strategy. That's supposed to be developed by all stakeholders, the government, private sector, and civil society. When we have a very strong cost estimates to implement this national financial strategy, we try to quantify the financial gap between, by comparing the financial need of the NBSAP and the current biodiversity expenditure at national level by all stakeholders. When we really understand the gap, where the financial gap, we put together all this information in a national biodiversity finance plan, which try to propose finance solution to address the different financial gap identified for the different biodiversity priority at national level. And then we go into the implementation phase. So to do this first step of these first 4 steps, it takes usually 2 years at national level. It's overseen by a committee which is composed by the private sector, the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment, usually agriculture, all the sector very dependent or impacting on biodiversity, and the civil society. It's endorsed at national level, and then it's implemented at national level. So what do we mean by finance solution, biodiversity finance solution in the biofin context? It's a very broad definition. It covers 4 expected financial results. The first one, it's finance solution or finance instrument that could generate additional revenue, right? Everybody think about this one, right? So it could be, for example, impact investment, it can be a green tax, it can be entrance fee in protected area. So this instrument will generate revenue that will contribute to protect or conserve biodiversity, right? That's one aspect of it. Second aspect, it's realign expenditure, right? So Peter mentioned that, for example, the world provide a lot of subsidy to many different production sectors, but often a lot of them have a negative impact on biodiversity. So in our process, when we identify that it's an issue at national level, we try to reform the subsidy to make sure that not harmful to biodiversity, and they are, in the opposite, try to promote green practices. The third category of finance instrument, it's instrument that will avoid future expenditure. For example, you can prevent the introduction of invasive species. Invasive species, as you know, is one of the major threats for biodiversity around the world. And if it's introduced in your country, it's almost impossible to remove or even to manage them. It's very, very expensive. So you have mechanism, for example, to control better the border and to share the cost of controlling the border with the private sector that can help to put in place an efficient system to prevent the introduction of invasive species, which in medium term could have a very negative impact on ecosystem services, which impact the private sector. And the third one, obviously, is like any businesses, you don't want to pour money in a system that's not efficient. So you look at improving the efficiency to deliver better the system to provide positive biodiversity income. So 4 main categories of finance solution. Based on this, and been working now since 2012 and 13 in 40 countries, we have listed in countries existing finance solution. And we come up with this list where you can see there's 67 main entry options to look at biodiversity finance and promote biodiversity conservation. Most of them are connected to the private sector, directly or indirectly, avoiding impact, generating revenue, linked to the 4 financial results that are proposed. Under these 67 main entry, we have subcategory, and we have a total of basically around 150 options for finance solution at national level. So the methodology, the biofin methodology, helps you to select which one of this one could be implemented or make sense at national level in consultation with the private sector, the government, in the civil society. And all of this is summarized in this national document, what we call the Biodiversity Finance Plan, which is approved by the highest authority in the country, the Cabinet of Ministers, or in some cases by the National Assembly. And then it's implemented. So to be a bit more specific, what's the link with the private sector and biofin? What we try to do. First one is to try to build alliance between the private sector and businesses that are very much on have information about biodiversity. It can be a linkage between NGO, environmental NGOs and businesses, financial institutions and environmental NGOs to create this partnership and to support this partnership, because we understand that the only way forward is to create this partnership between the different stakeholders. Two, we try to promote sustainable standard and certification. So all kind of green label for the textile, for example, for tourism, for the fishery, sustainable label, try to promote them and try to link it up to fiscal incentive if it's possible at national context. And the same, we try to promote for businesses to have a sustainable value of chain on sourcing, to make sure that all their practices are sustainable in the long term. Then we look at different new investment strategy which involve the private sector. So we got crowdfunding. Crowdfunding can be linked to the banking system, right? Some banking system with the CSR can try to mobilize crowdfunding money to support biodiversity outcome, but as well, mobile company can do that. And there's other digital company, technology company who can do that. We have insurance company as well, as Peter mentioned, you know, like insurance company are looking at the field of coral reef insurance, for example, wetland insurance. You will as well green bond and blue bond, the space of green bond and blue bond with financial institution, putting together international investors with local bank. And as well, you got impact investing in conservation. And the third main category is to develop public-private collaboration around protected areas, around incentive for conservation business, and around bank as well. So all the information of biofin, you can find it on the biofin website, biofin.org. We have several publications. You can find the methodology. We got a publication really focusing on private sector, which is called Moving Mountains. It's in there. You can find a list of finance solutions in there. And you can have a little book, you can find the little book of investment in nature. We describe all the different finance solutions that you can find around the world. Finally, I would like to mention one very important global initiative that's taking place now. We got the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, which was set up very recently in July, August this year. And that put together around 250 financial institutions together. And the aim is to develop a risk management and disclosure framework on nature risk. And many banks are involved around the world. And this will have a lot of impact on banks to lend money to businesses. And they want to make sure that they don't lend money to businesses with risk who are too much exposed to biodiversity loss. And I'm sure we will hear more about this with Tata Steel, because Tata Steel is a member of TNF Nature-Related Financial Disclosure Task Force, and maybe we will present some more information about it. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Hervé, while you were speaking, I think many participants would have noticed that biofin engages with governments, yeah? And since the topic of biodiversity management often transcends geopolitical boundaries, have you already had a chance to work together with neighboring governments? And who knows, maybe via biofin initiative, you can also contribute to peace in the region, yeah, by conserving the resources which are leading to conflicts. Has biofin already had a chance where you're engaging with 2 or 3 governments who are neighboring, the countries are neighboring countries, which are all facing, let's say, the same issue in terms of the watershed, and how you are bringing them together?
Yeah, we do this. I mean, the philosophy of Biofin is to share experience on among countries. So we organize every year regional workshops. So we got regional workshop with all Biofin country in Asia, regional workshop with all African country, and regional workshop with all the Latin America country. And as well, we got global workshop where we can share experiences. So the idea is really to share and learn experiences among the countries. But to go a bit more in focus on your question, we've been working in many countries to try, for example, on protected area. In some countries, you got protected area are co-managed by 2 or 3 different countries, and we try to bring together the management of these different countries and try to harmonize their policy, because some cases the policy is very different and not compatible, and that create a distortion at the regional market. So there's this collaboration at regional level that takes place. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing.
And as well, another thematic on this is biodiversity compensation. Latin America try to put a biodiversity offset mechanism, but they want to make sure that it's the same between all the countries, to try to ensure to respect the competitivity of businesses compared to one country to another country. So there's different need to harmonize policy within a region.
Okay, got it. Thanks for elaborating. So now, having looked at why and how the finance sector should be taking care and accounting for biodiversity impacts, how Biofin engages with governments and the private sector via its incentive mechanism, it's worthwhile now to see how industries can take this concept of biodiversity management, conservation, protection, and integrate it within their operations, whether individual companies or industry sectors and so on. And for that, we'll have Jan Willem. He's with the Biodiversity Consultancy. Together with his team, they prepare these comprehensive guidance for industries, but also for individual companies, that they be able to integrate biodiversity aspects within their overall management systems. An interesting part about Jan is, while he's originally from the Netherlands, he grew up in a small island in Caribbean, enjoying the tidal pools. And this is where he developed his love for animals and the sea, finally ending up in this career as a marine conservationist. So Jan, please, if you can share your experience, your expertise, and also your guidance for companies who might be interested in incorporating biodiversity within their plans. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rakesh, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you today about more of the business angle, so the business case for biodiversity, but also how businesses can actually measure their impacts to biodiversity, to nature, and contribute towards sustainable development goals. So as the previous 2 speakers have already underlined, nature and of course also climate are critical for supporting a healthy society and the well-being of people, and also a healthy economy. And nature really underpins the sustainable development goals that are presented here. So the bottom rank there shows you the biosphere and the related sustainable development goals for both nature and climate. So I just wanted to reiterate that point. And therefore, the ongoing loss and deterioration of biodiversity pose a significant risk to businesses and to finance. That risk, as pointed out by Peter, is not fully appreciated. It's appreciated by some, but really we can expect that understanding, that awareness to reach similar levels as we've started seeing for climate disruption. Some of those risks we recently identified in a report that we put together with WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. That report is available from our website. identifies three broad categories of biodiversity risk, namely physical risk associated with the direct loss of biodiversity and the associated services that biodiversity provides. And those kind of impacts include conversion of ecosystems, climate change, overexploitation, pollution, and invasive species. The second broad category is transitional risk. So changes in how we account for perceived biodiversity loss, including tightening of regulations, stricter financing requirements, but also expectations from society and how people view businesses and how they are impacting the environment, and therefore changing consumer preferences. And lastly, systemic risk related to the large-scale disruptions of natural systems. And within that category, we can imagine the current COVID pandemic playing a role. So very disruptive events that really dramatically change our economies and social structures and create significant crises. All these different biodiversity risks, of course, have impacts to businesses, including scarcity of resources, disruption of supply chains and value chain, decline of the attractiveness of particular areas for tourism, project delays, stranded assets, damage to brands, reputational damage, to name just a few examples. And those in turn can cause impacts on finance as well, whether it's the risks of markets changing, shares fluctuating, bonds, credit risks, etc., etc. So there is a clear link, causal link between loss of biodiversity and the impacts it has on business and finance. And the awareness of those risks is rising. And we see that every year when we look at the World Economic Forum assessment of global risks, both in terms of the impact and likelihood of those risks. And biodiversity loss is increasingly moving into the top right quadrant, linked closely with climate change. Climate change is still seen as the biggest risk, but biodiversity is catching up fast. And it's now recognized together with climate change as the highest risk to global economic activity. That is because of the escalating rate of biodiversity loss around the world, the associated erosion of ecosystem services, but also the tightening regulations around how we limit the impacts of businesses to nature, the financing requirements that are becoming more stringent, increasing societal concern, of course, around what's happening to nature, and international activism, and the rise of rapid communication, which means increasingly people are aware of what's happening, not just in their backyard, but globally, and are increasingly concerned and are expecting businesses to make dramatic changes. Finance lenders are also responding to this, and there are a number of environmental safeguards that have been put in place by some of the leading financial institutions, including the International Finance Corporation through its performance standards, and they have a performance standard 6, which is related to biodiversity and sustainable management of natural resources. And IFC Performance Standard 6 is widely regarded as the benchmark of international good practice. And many of the international development banks are currently revising their frameworks to align with PS6, including the Asian Development Bank. And so there is an increasing expectation for businesses that are requiring loans from these banks to meet increasingly stringent performance standards for biodiversity. Businesses, of course, are responding to this as well. Businesses are increasingly pushing governments to actually do more around preventing and halting biodiversity loss, and going beyond simple impact reduction through mitigation, but actually adopting positive outcome targets. So nature positive outcomes is becoming increasingly relevant to leading businesses. And so that is also an important driver for change at the moment. And nature positive is a concept that certainly from our perspective is really taking off. And similar to companies establishing climate targets, we can expect an increasing number of businesses to establish nature positive targets as well. And there's clear opportunities for businesses who are thinking about nature and thinking about reducing their impacts to nature. So it can help secure a license to operate, in turn reduce operational costs. It can help them align with regulations and changes to regulations in order to be able to maintain access to capital and also increase market access by demonstrating that they are doing the right thing around nature and making changes. It can help enhance their reputation and the company value. So there's a number of ways that businesses that are taking action to be less nature negative and indeed nature positive can have a leading edge over other competitors. It's going to be really important to measure biodiversity. Similar to how we measure carbon, we're going to need to find a way to measure the impact to nature. And the next big conference of the parties will be focused around nature, with the CBD COP happening early next year. And it's very likely that there's going to be specific targets focused around nature coming out of that, both in terms of reducing species extinction risk, but also maintaining connectivity and restoring natural ecosystems. And so we're going to need a set of targets that will allow us to guide investment, understand both the negative and positive impacts that are going to be informative and easy to use, which, as you can imagine, is not so straightforward to a complex thing like nature, like biodiversity. But it needs to be able to be comparative and be able to be shared between businesses and civil society and government. So with that in mind, I just wanted to introduce two biodiversity metrics that we have been applying to allow businesses to measure their impact. One is focused around ecosystems and the other is focused around species. And the ecosystem one is regarded as the Biodiversity Extent, Condition and Significance Framework, or BECS. And it's basically a way to measure the impact of land use change, so the loss of ecosystems, not just in terms of their extent, but also the loss in their condition, so the degradation. And it brings in a significance aspect as well, which is typically defined by the biodiversity within that ecosystem, within that habitat. And that's where we come to the species metric, which is the one I'd like to focus on a little bit more. And that's the species threat abatement and restoration metric. It sounds very complicated, but basically what it does is it allows you to measure the impacts that you're having to species. And that includes both positive and negative impacts. And it's really focused around measuring positive change to species and to their threat status. So the IUCN has a red list, which looks at all the species and categorizes them based on their threat status. And what STAR does, so that's how we've shortened this metric, STAR, it basically sums up the scores of the different species that are present within any particular area of interest, and looks at the not only the presence, but also how much of their range is within that particular area. So in this case, we have 3 species, one which is completely within the area of interest, and 2 others, a bird and a mammal, a primate, which are partly included in this area of interest. And they have different threat categories. So we're looking at a highly endangered primate, an endangered bird, and a vulnerable species of frog. And the way that STAR works is that it weights the species based on their threat status. So a critically endangered species is weighted much higher than a species which is only threatened. And by summing up the scores, combining both the proportion of its range by the threat status, we get an overall STAR score for the area of interest. And that STAR score basically tells us the the points, if you like, that we can gain by addressing the threats within that particular area that we're interested in. So it's a really useful tool, a really useful metric to quickly understand where we might want to intervene, where we might want to focus our conservation efforts or finance conservation efforts in order to achieve the maximum change in threatened species and reduce the threatened species status level to much lower categories and therefore avert extinction risk. And here we just have a couple of maps. So we have a global layer of star, which shows you different areas that have high star values in green. And below that is simply an indication of what that could look like. So you can identify different areas of interest, compare those between each other, and be able to identify where conservation interventions would have the biggest impact to a business. And this is important because as we were looking at earlier, companies are increasingly establishing science-based targets for nature, so similar to climate targets, ambitious goals that aim to achieve an overall positive impact to nature. Often this is to offset their impacts from their developments on the ground or supply chain impacts, but sometimes it's also just companies committing to be nature positive. And so they want to be able to find a way that's relatively easy to measure their impact and can also be compared. So that's the nice thing about STAR, is that it's completely scalable, and it allows you to compare different sites between each other and quantify the contributions that you're making towards wider national and international conservation goals. And so it's a really useful tool to guide and prioritize investment into species and allow companies to undertake a portfolio assessment of where the biodiversity risks are along their supply chain, but also, of course, where the opportunities are to address those risks. Typically, STAR as a species-specific metric is used in combination with another metric like the previous one we're looking at, like BECS, which measures also impacts to ecosystems. But STAR is one of those two metrics which we've been applying more and more, which companies are taking a real interest in using. So I'll leave it at that. We, of course, have a lot more information available through our website, and we put out these insights pieces. So I would invite you to have a look at those. And of course, feel free to be in touch with me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for introducing those frameworks along with how they are giving us an insight into how it looks. While we would have ideally wanted to see what the audience thinks about biodiversity for business before, let's have a quick look now with the poll to see if what you see is what you were expecting, Jan. Yeah? So if participants can please select what they feel are the most important business drivers for managing biodiversity risk. Of course, Peter, Jan, and Hervé, they have already given some insights into what might be relevant, but it will be useful to know from your perspective, what do you consider as important business drivers? Is it from the perspective of enhancing your brand and reputation that you would want to address this risk, or reducing your operational costs, aligning with, let's say, future regulations or current regulations, or to secure a license to operate in that area? It could also be that you would want to increase your market access by doing the right thing about biodiversity. Or, as we heard about requirements from Performance Standard 6 and also from Hervé about how they tie their access to capital based on certain conditions being fulfilled, that maybe you would want to maintain access to capital by safeguarding biodiversity. So if you could please select your choice, and Ryan, let's pull up the results so Jan can briefly have a look and reflect on it. Okay, so it's a wide variety. But at the moment, the clear winner is aligning with regulations, maybe current or future, but also enhancing brand reputation, license to operate, and so on. Jan, is this what you were hoping? Or are you seeing something similar?
I suppose it makes sense that there is a broad recognition across these different different aspects. And of course, they are all interrelated as well, as I was trying to show. So it's perhaps not surprising, but yeah, aligning with regulations and enhancing brand and reputation as well as securing a license to operate are all important aspects. And we can expect to continue to see that changing in the future as governments are increasingly, being more stringent and being more protective of their natural resources, and ensuring that businesses are contributing to the protection and not degrading those.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, having looked at those frameworks, let's see how companies are putting these frameworks to use. And for that, we will hear from Dr. Hishmi Hussain. Over the past 2 decades, he's been focusing on biodiversity conservation, on the intersection with climate and environment. He currently leads biodiversity and sustainable development for Tata Steel. He shared his short message with us. So Ryan, if we can please listen to Dr. Hussain as to how a company is putting all of those guidelines, frameworks to use, yeah?
Good morning to all. Thank you to UV for giving me the opportunity to talk on biodiversity protection in action. Biodiversity protection is not simple, it is complex, but it is not impossible to achieve. We can achieve biodiversity protection by understanding and evaluating our impact on biodiversity, by meticulous planning of biodiversity management plan, and by monitoring of these biodiversity initiatives. Let me share my screen. Next 10 minutes, I am going to talk about the significance of biodiversity for the business. I will talk about the Tata Steel journey on biodiversity management. I will also speak about some of the key initiatives which are important for the business, as well as they can contribute in biodiversity conservation. So biodiversity is identified one of a key focus for Tata Group, and Tata Steel also identified biodiversity as one of a material issue for us. If we want to make a sustainable future, we must think and act for climate change. We must act for water conservation. We must manage our waste. We must consider biodiversity collapse as one of a very high risk for all of us. Our future priority for sustainability are: we want to reduce our carbon footprint. We want to reduce our freshwater consumption. We want to adopt green technology. We want to use 100% of our waste material generated from our operations. We want to achieve no net loss of biodiversity. The recent IPBES assessment has indicated that we have lost 60% of animal population in last 50 years. About 1 million species out of 8 million species are about to extinct. The nature is dangerously declining. Whatever we are doing, this is not sufficient. We need to do some transformative changes. We are losing 88,000 square kilometers of forest every year. We are losing about 85% of water bodies in last 300 years. We have lost 35% of pollinators, and all are impacting to our nature. The World Economic Forum also identified biodiversity risk as among the top 5 risks in last 5 years. In this slide, I'm going to talk about the important milestone of biodiversity management at Tata Steel. In 2013, we have started the partnership with IUCN for biodiversity management. In 2016, we have released the biodiversity policy. We were the first company in India to have biodiversity policy. In 2018, we were able to cover our all mining locations under the biodiversity management plan. In 2019, we have constituted Center of Excellence for Biodiversity Management. In 2021, we have covered more than 50% of our site under the biodiversity management plan, and we are targeting to cover all our site by 2025. Our approach for biodiversity conservation is the mitigation hierarchy. Our objective is to achieve the no net loss. To implement the mitigation hierarchy, we want to avoid unacceptable impact of our operation on biodiversity. We want to reduce our impact that may occur because of our operation. We want to restore the ecosystem where we are operating. We seek additional opportunities to contribute the local conservation. For implementing this approach, we have constituted the Center of Excellence for Biodiversity Management, which is chaired by the Vice President Raw Material and Vice President Corporate Services. These are the two business heads which are responsible for mining business, and another is responsible for the corporate administration. We are having a working group team which is comprises from the cross-functional across Tata Steel. These are the people who are responsible for implementing of biodiversity project on the sites. The key responsibilities of Center of Excellence is to develop the new biodiversity management plan, support and implement the review of biodiversity management plan, and capacity building for the employees. For better understanding, I would like to share about our engagement with IUCN in detail. We have divided the engagement with IUCN in two phases. The first phase is planning, which is from 2023 to 16, in which we have conducted the biodiversity assessment to understand our footprint or our impact on biodiversity. We have evaluated ecosystem services on which our mines are dependent. We have conducted the capacity building exercises and the workshop, which help to understand the relation between the ecosystem and the businesses for us. We also consulted the senior leadership to get their input for developing the biodiversity policy. We also consulted with the communities. We have interviewed them to understand the trends of the ecosystem services. We have released the biodiversity policy in 2016, and we have made 8 biodiversity management plans for our mining location in the first phase. In the second phase, where we have implemented the biodiversity management plan, we also monitor it. We have established the monitoring mechanism with the help of BIRS. It is a biodiversity indicator and reporting system. We have organized the independent reviews for our biodiversity initiative. We also conducted the capacity building exercises. We understand the importance of biodiversity. I have explained about the journey of the biodiversity management and our approach for biodiversity management. Here are some projects for your ready reference. We have implemented this project keeping in mind to restoring the ecosystem. And the United Nations also come with the theme this year, the decade of ecosystem restoration. That ecosystem restoration is important for improving or conserving the biodiversity. It helps in building the climate resilient societies. It also helps in creating the livelihood. So the importance of ecosystem restoration, we all know. So we have implemented this project, the eradication of invasive species. We have done mapping of threatened plants so we can conserve them. We have developed the nurseries of the local plant. We have implemented the bird niche nesting program. We have implemented the wildlife corridor conservation program. We have done ecosystem restoration program across our mining location. And all these projects are contributing in enhancing the biodiversity across Tata Steel. Here are 2 success stories. These stories has been adopted by other businesses as well. And it is also published by IUCN and other conservation organization. One is the bird niche nesting. We have installed the bird nest for conserving the biodiversity where the habitat has been lost because of the activity. We have reclaimed and rehabilitated the waste dump sites into the forest. We have used about 1.9 lakhs trees of 45 local species to conserve it. Now I'm talking one of the example from our mining location. So this is the reclamation of 100 hectare land into the biodiversity park, which you can see in the picture before and after. In this park, we have make a nursery which is having a capacity of 1 lakh plants to be grown in it. We have implemented with the help of butterfly garden to help the pollinators, hibiscus garden and medicinal park. So again, it is helping in improving the biodiversity in the area. Now I'm talking one example from Jamshedpur. It is from the cold rolling mill. This is one of old ash pond in 5.6 hectare area. So that water body, you can see it was full of slush and pond with algae. We have converted it into a beautiful pond. We have created this water body, which is now helping in collecting 82,000 cubic meter of rainwater. We have planted 5,000 trees around it. So it help in improving the green cover, as well as it is attracting birds and butterfly. And it is also helping the local people who are around to get the livelihood. This work also got the recognition by CII in 2020. These are my contact details. I will be happy to address any of the questions if you are having. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
All right. Having looked at one example of Tata Steel and how they are taking care of biodiversity at different areas, I mean, the extractive industry has been focus of attention because, of course, of its impact it has. Now, let's also look at a broader view. For that, we have Dr. Praveer Deshmukh, who is a counselor with the India Business and Biodiversity Initiative. Praveer's doctorate is with botany, and his focus is on the integration of biodiversity and environmental management. He's been working with institutions both locally but also globally on how they could integrate biodiversity value within their decision making. So Praveer, if you can share with us some examples on how companies across different industry sectors are involved in the initiative, and more interestingly, if you can give us an idea about the assessment framework that the companies are using to guide their plans. And finally, if you can compress all the work that you have been doing over so many years within about 5 minutes. Yeah. Thanks, Praveer.
Yeah, thanks, Rakesh, and thanks for inviting. So hope I'm audible or...
Yes.
Yeah. So just a minute, I will just share my screen.
Praveer, would you like me to share?
Yeah, no, I think it's working. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Hope it is visible in a presentation mode.
Yes.
Yeah. So I will very quickly go through it, and I think fortunately some of my members are already there. So Tata Steel is also one of the pioneering member who joined this IBBI initiative during the conceptualization phase. So it's called as the India Business and Biodiversity Initiative. And again, this is again, now we are actually reworking on that, how we can, within a biodiversity, we can integrate climate change and biodiversity part as a part of it. So again, this is again totally a partnership initiative between the government and industry, and CI is hosting this initiative because we, at that time, it has been decided that let's make a neutral platform where business can freely come forward rather than a regulatory framework. So then from that 2014, we are hosting as a CII. So it is totally a business-led initiative, and the businesses are developing the action plans for the biodiversity. So these are the members who are actually signatory to the businesses are signatory to IBBI. They have given a commitment that they will integrate IBBI 10-point declarations on the biodiversity conservation and sustainable utilizations in the business decision making. So these are 10 businesses. Along with that, we're also having a different stakeholders members, because these are the knowledge platforms which are part of this IBBI. They also guide us in giving us a suggestion that what is the need of requirement, what is the science is required for a decision making. So with these things, we are actually analyzing and supporting the businesses. So I think Rakesh has briefly mentioned about the tool, what we are using. I think one of the basic tools what we adopted from this last few years working with the multiple businesses and all these things. And again, this is more on the decision making front. So really what is my linkages to the biodiversity, how I am impacting or dependent on it, or many my supply chain is also dependent, or if something is happening in my supply chain, if there is a RET species is happening, or some new area has been recognized as a endangered areas or conservation areas, what is the impact my operations or the my supply chain operations or my stakeholders. So we have adopted this a risk-based approach in the biodiversity, and we have modified this is in a so this is one of the tool which we are utilizing with the businesses. So the step one is definitely understanding the biodiversity baseline, where we are actually going beyond the species. We are also trying to identify which are the different ecosystems are there, because then company are able to understand that definitely they are not impacting on a species. So for example, in a agri processing company, they are not directly impacting any species or maybe wildlife or anything, but might be utilization of the fertilizers or pesticides they are impacting. So understanding the where are they creating the impact drivers or dependency drivers. So this is again in a stage one, we identify these drivers, then also identify which are the risk areas are there. So really the species composition is declining, or maybe the insect population is increasing, which is harmful for the crops or something like that. So these are the indicators we identify or we assess from the company's assessment. And then we also check that what is their existing plan. So what is happening in most of the companies with their sustainabilities and other aspect, they already have some plans. So in agriculture sector, or maybe you can say in a global spice sector, they have a sustainable supply chain management plans and all these things, where some of the indicators for the biodiversity or ecosystem services are addressed, but it is not solely focused on the species conservations and all these things. So we understand what is they are implementing and how we can help in enhancing some of the areas directly. So they didn't have to create a new framework, but within an existing framework, how they can modify their management plans or work on a more actionable agendas. So this is a stage more in the assessing the gaps and then developing the action plan. And again, this ecosystem services, this is how we actually show them that these are the ecosystem services, how the different ecosystems are there, what is your dependencies. So it first is column is dependency, then impact, which is in the blue color, and then what is your management level. And then we analyze that, okay, in which areas you are lagging, in which areas you are performing well, or you are not managing this ecosystem very properly. That will give them a clear understanding that where they can focus in the working areas. So for example, in this company, the river and pond, they are not managing it properly. And if this is an agriculture company, if they are working on agriculture, if they are not managing river and ponds, the water scarcity will be a critical issue. And that's why it is a high risk areas or high dependency areas we have created. And this actually give them a more correct way to work with them. And then based on that, they can develop a specific action plan for managing this critical risk. So now what we'll do, this is again a case study, what we studied in the past few years with the Mahindra, some other companies. So this is a tourism sector company. I think you already know the Club Mahindra is one of the India's premium resorts and all these things. So they have one plot in Madikeri area, which is again a IUCN red listed hotspot area, where they have a plot. And then what they did during the construction phase, they try to identify that how they can reduce the cutting of the trees and all this thing in that area. And now they're only utilizing only 26% of that plot area for their resorts. They also adopted the design, which is again native to that area. So it's again the local understanding or indigenous knowledge or local knowledge they have integrated into the design things. And you can I also want to share, these resorts are not having any single AC installed into them. So it's only operating on the fans or the natural air. And during our study in 2017 and 2018, we have analyzed that at the ambient temperature is again 2 to 3 degrees less in their resort, because there is no AC, the dense green cover is there. But again, companies are not able to understand really how it is benefiting to them. Then we have take this data, the business case data from them, that if you want to install the ACs, what is the additional cost you will be investing? So it's not installing the ACs, but again, the maintenance and the power requirement, the electricity charges, that what they have analyzed, and they come up with a number that if they want to go with the ACs and all related infrastructures, they have to invest 384 crores in one resort for 1 year to install the ACs and all these things. But this is again a cost has been saved. Along with that, we also give them an additional benefit that this 222 rooms are 220 rooms are you are operating, and you are not spending any electricity charges for the AC use and all these things. So you already saved this 1.85 crores, and this numbers is again continuously increasing. So when we have shared this case study with them, suddenly the management is now very keen to work on all their resort, that how they can go with a minimum ACs or maximize the plantation and all this area. So this is again one of the best case studies. And I think this is again linking with the tourism sector, because they want to showcase that this is a very natural areas and all these things, and showcasing this type of infrastructures and showcasing this thing to the customers and investors. It is much more beneficial for them, and they are started operating all these methodologies in their new sector, new resorts and new existing resorts also.
Thank you.
Maybe this is a last case study. I do have more case studies, and maybe this presentation will be available with Rakesh, so you can share with anybody. I think this is a NTPC, National Thermal Power Producer Company in India. This is again one of the biggest thermal power producer in India. They have a project along the Andhra Pradesh coast, which is a coastal area, and also that coast is also known for the olive-ridley turtle nesting sites. Again, at present, their impact is not that much to the olive-ridley turtle, but they still gone forward and collaborated with the local forest department for having a structured plan for their hatchling conservation. So they invested in it. And again, the project has started in 2015, and when we did study in 2018 and 19, the population has been increased because they are able to give the fund when the funds are required for forest department. When the nesting is happening, they can the forest department then can hire local communities to conserve it, which is happening previously because they are using this turtle as a food and all these things. Now they have other livelihood which is available for because of the conservation. So this is again happens, and then the conservation has happens. The species number has been increased, or the hatchling which is now released into the sea has been increased. So this is how a simple investment or simple way of investment can help companies to mitigate some risk. And this is again what will happen if the species number is continuously decline, and TPC may not be able to operate long term in that area for their thermal power plant. But again, with a very small investment, they are able to extend their license to operate, or the regulatory issues and all these things. So these are the ways I think companies can work to understand what is my challenges and then where I can invest. So there are again, you didn't need to conserve the species or protect the species, or again invest into the national parks, but within the nearby areas, you can also identify which are the critical divers and then work on it. So there are more cases studies are available, and you can follow the India Business and Biodiversity page where lots of publications are available, and I will be happy to work with you for any other aspects.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Praveer, for sharing those examples, but also showing us the tool. Now, having heard from experts so far with regards to the frameworks, with regards to financial risk, with regards to possibilities, now it's once again chance for all of you to share feedback with our experts. What do you feel should happen next? After listening and seeing all the details with regards to risk, with regards to opportunities and implications, do you feel that we should continue business as usual, since somehow biodiversity is already part of risk management or sustainability plans? Do you feel that there is now a need of industry-specific indicators for biodiversity, along with inclusion of geographical variances, let's say in South Asia, in Africa, and so on? What additional parameters or metrics should be considered for the industry? Do you feel that industry associations should take the lead like we are observing? Or do you feel that states and counties and governments should come forward and say, well, these are the targets for all operators in this region, whether you are a farm, whether you are an industry, whether you are a housing society? Or do you feel, well, we need much more training and workshops from these experts that you heard today to try and understand what has to be done to try and identify the opportunities that biodiversity conservation or management might pose? Do you also feel that since this is such a complex topic of the interconnection between the ecosphere, the biosphere, the technosphere, and so on, that maybe now investors, governments, companies need to hire more botanists, more physicists, more geologists, more scientists to try and interlink it into policy making, decision making? Or do you see that we need to further clarify what are the risks and opportunities for investors? Yeah. And finally, do you feel that next year's biodiversity COP should be democratized even more? It should be open. More people should be able to participate virtually, should be able to contribute, should be able to raise questions and so on. So if you can select the top three, I'm sure that many of you might feel all of this needs to happen, but from your perspective, with your emotion and passion, what are the top three that should happen? If you can please select. And Ryan, maybe we display the results so our speakers can reflect on it. So we see the point about industry-specific biodiversity indicators. We see that need for additional training, of course. We also see the point about investors should consider hiring more of these technical experts. And maybe we go in the reverse order now. Praveer, are you observing that maybe members of IBBI or elsewhere are now asking you to prepare industry-specific metrics and indicators to measure their performance against biodiversity impact and value?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Rakesh. Yeah, so lots of company-specific work is coming because I think industry-specific is not possible in the biodiversity perspective. Because if you just take an example that the food sector company or agriculture company working in north area or in the south areas, they have a perfectly different terrains and different challenges there. But again, now they are developing their operation specific things to monitor. And I think this is in line with their sustainability perspectives and all these things. So I think it is much easy to integrate them. But yes, there definitely lots of companies are coming forward. And what happens in the last few years, so about this, out of this 40 companies, I think Tata Steel is definitely having a biodiversity policy in place. Almost 30 new companies are also now started coming with their no net loss commitment by 2030 or 2040. So that traction is going on, and they're now looking at that how to monitor this transition, just like a climate transition.
Got it. Okay, thanks for that. Then we see one of the options being that there's a need for further trainings to demystify biodiversity conservation and so on, and that also companies and investors should hire more of these technical experts. So Jan Willem, have you been receiving job offers from investors and from additional companies to have experts and marine conservation as part of their business? Or are you being seconded to companies?
No, I'm very much spending my time with TBC, the Biodiversity Consultancy, but yeah, there's definitely an increase in the need for specialists to help companies demystify biodiversity and help them understand what the trends are and what they should be doing to do a better job of managing their biodiversity risks. Absolutely, we're seeing that.
Okay, thank you for that. Then Hervé, to you, some of the participants mentioned, or many of them mentioned, that states and governments should convene the stakeholders, should agree and assign on targets. Is this also what you're seeing as BioFin when you are engaging with the governments, that they are taking a more assertive role on bringing together stakeholders?
Yeah, definitely. It's a process to involve all stakeholders at national level, and the private sector, it's a key stakeholder. It's not possible to improve a system without the private sector. So we hope that the private sector will fully contribute to this national process. and make known their views and their points, and to be able to develop appropriate policy to ensure that it's a win-win situation for the private sector and for the regulator as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. And then Peter, for you, you mentioned during your talk that, well, we're not getting these requests for additional deep dive workshops and so on, but we hope that in the next 2 years, we will. So from the investor community perspective and your engagement, what do you hope should happen in the next 2 years? And if 2 years later, you are once again introducing to our audience in Asia, what's happening in terms of in the investment world concerning biodiversity, what do you hope to be sharing with us?
Yes, I think I would hope to be able to say that biodiversity and nature have caught up with climate and become sort of equally important considerations for investors. I would hope to say that we could see evidence of capital being reallocated away from companies that have an unreasonably heavy sort of heavy footprint on biodiversity towards companies that, like Tata Steel, are doing good things to actually enhance biodiversity or at least to reduce their impact. So I think what I would hope to see within 2 years is evidence of real shift in the capital markets. I was interested by the previous poll where I think 41% of people were suggesting that maintaining access to capital was important. I would like to see that percentage go far above 50% in the minds of businesses, so that when they're considering their practices, they're looking to see what would actually attract capital towards them in terms of their biodiversity approach.
Okay, thank you. Well, what we have heard from you is there are organizations, there are countries across this wide spectrum of many who have been maturely handling this, but many others who are just starting off. So on behalf of all the participants, I want to say thank you to our speakers, to our panelists, to the experts for taking the time, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your experience, for sharing your wisdom with all the participants. And I'm sure that many of the participants today will be able to take what you have provided and to start off on this journey where you have been perhaps for many years or decades, and then to catch up with what you are doing with other companies. So thanks a lot for everybody for also staying a little bit longer. Thank you once again. And thank you also, Ryan, for coordinating and taking care of everything. Please take care, and best wishes for rest of this year. Until later. Bye.